Thanks for coming, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you the speaker for today. He's a colleague actually of this International Payments for Ecosystem Services. It was all started, the first time I heard this topic was during 2007 in Yale University when he first introduced the concept of this IPES, and before the RED, the other international payment schemes were introduced. So he's one of the pioneers of this concept. Currently, he's a coordinator of IUCN's work on greening the world economy or green economy. And his expertise lies mainly in the use of incentive-based mechanism for conservation. And he has written widely issues related to the design and implementation of payments for ecosystem services. I don't want to go further, and let's hear Mr. David Huberman on his topic, International Payments for Ecosystem Services, reviewing its scope, purpose, and potential. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. Thank you everybody for coming to listen to this presentation. I hope you'll find it interesting, and I look forward to having a discussion afterwards, and I hope that I can give you some interesting insights and useful bits of information about this concept of international payments for ecosystem services and the main issues that it attempts to address. So yeah, as Grace says, this is something that I've been involved with for about 4 or 5 years now. It started when I was working as a consultant for UNEP, their economics and trade branch in Geneva, and they had a partnership with IUCN at the time to try and develop this concept of international payments for ecosystem services. It was also in collaboration with the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. And so I just came in to help out with the organization of an expert workshop and was part of sort of the first steps of this initiative, which started already back in 2006. And I think it's fair to say that it's been advancing quite slowly, I would say, since. And I think there's many reasons for that. And that's what I'll get into today. And hopefully at the end of the presentation you'll get an understanding of a bit of how the context has changed at the time that this new concept was launched, and sort of what the current landscape is for developing this initiative, given our situation today in 2011, 5 years after it was sort of first floated to the world. So I'm here representing IUCN, just so that I can get a sense. Do people here know who IUCN is? Is anybody, how many people know IUCN or are aware of it? About half or so. All right. I think it's useful just to give a general sense. IUCN is the International Union for Conservation of Nature. We're meant to serve sort of as an umbrella organization for the conservation community. And we have members that are both governments and NGOs. And as is said in the acronym, our main interest is in conservation, conserving biodiversity. We do things such as lists of endangered and threatened species. We monitor protected areas. And so really our expertise is on biodiversity conservation, ecosystem services, but we also obviously work a lot in development and trying to find solutions that are based on ecosystems, based on biodiversity, but for obviously broader development objectives of rural development, livelihoods improvement, food security, etc. So that's sort of where IUCN works. So that's obviously where this interest comes from, international payments for ecosystem services, trying to find solutions for valuing ecosystems and trying to capitalize on their different values. So with that general context, this is how I've structured our session together this morning. I'm going to give a few introductory slides on the concept of payments for ecosystem services. I'm assuming that some of you are aware of this, maybe not everybody. I'll try not to dwell too long on it, but it is quite a complicated concept. And then I'll get into a bit more of a discussion on international payments for ecosystem services, what's its purpose, how can it complement existing schemes that already exist for financing ecosystem services, a few thoughts on what are the strategies for implementing them, and then I'll end with just a few thoughts on the possibilities for further development of IPES, and then very much look forward to your questions and a discussion at the end. All right, yeah, I think it's useful to start with a definition. Perhaps some of you have already seen this definition by Sven Munder. It's the most often cited one to explain what this concept of payments for ecosystem services is all about. A voluntary transaction in which a well-defined ecosystem service or a land use likely to secure that service is being bought by at least one buyer from at least one provider, if and only if the provider secures the provision of the ecosystem service. I don't want to dwell too long on this. I think that the most important thing to highlight at this stage is we're talking about brokering deals around ecosystem services, where we're trying to get beneficiaries to reward or provide incentives or payments for providers of ecosystem services, and sort of working on that relationship between those who benefit from the services provided by ecosystems and those who are responsible for the land that is providing that ecosystem service. So those are the pieces we have in that definition. So obviously it is centered around the notion of ecosystem services. And in my own opinion, I think that really is what makes this concept of payments for ecosystem services so unique. It's fair to say the notion of ecosystem services is relatively recently popularized. I think here is the framework of ecosystem services that was presented in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that was published in 2005. And at that time, it really was seen as almost somewhat of a change in paradigms in how we thought about the environment and how it supported human well-being. So this basic framework that we have here, you see there's a lot of different arrows connecting ecosystem services on the left to constituents of well-being on the right. So I think that is the main message from this slide is that there are a lot of relationships there between ecosystem service and human well-being, meaning that the values that we get from ecosystems are many. But what this Millennium Ecosystem Assessment succeeded in doing is providing a framework, what you see on the left, for the different types of ecosystem services, the different types of benefits that people get from ecosystems. So we have here the 4 basic categories, where we have the supporting services seen sort of as the backbone that they feed into the 3 other types. And these are basic processes such as recycling of nutrients, the forming of soils, and those enable different types of ecosystem services, provisioning services. So obviously the benefits that people get from ecosystems in the form of food, fresh water, fuel, wood. Other people would simply call these ecosystem goods. Regulating services, the regulation of the climate, for example, the carbon cycle, the regulation of the water flows, water cycles, obviously control for pests and pathogens. And then finally, sort of touching on the intangible values of ecosystems, the cultural services, what they provide societies in terms of aesthetic values, cultural, religious, spiritual, and obviously recreational, the benefits that people get from enjoying the ecosystems from the point of view of the tourism industry, for example. So here is basically the backbone of the notion of paying for ecosystem services. It's recognizing our dependencies on the different services and trying to find means to create deals between those who benefit and those who are responsible for the provision of different services. And so there are many different types of services that have been the target of these types of deals. What this table is doing, it's classifying the different ecosystem services according to the status as was put out in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, looking at the different ecosystem services, which found that a pretty large majority of them are degraded. So in the middle column there, some have been enhanced over the past years, and then we see some mixed results. And what is put in green are ecosystem services for which markets exist. And so obviously here we're looking at a lot of what we saw on the previous slide as being the provisioning services. So ecosystem goods, crops, livestock, aquaculture, fisheries, timber. These are ecosystem services for which people are already used to paying for, in a sense. And there are many others that are currently outside of markets. And so we see two distinct strategies in terms of fixing existing markets, recognizing that in the price that people pay for timber, we're probably not capturing the full values of that ecosystem good or that ecosystem service of providing timber. We're not obviously not capturing the other ecosystem services that would be associated with the forest. The same for fisheries, for crops. So those markets could be fixed. We could be paying more, but we're also interested in creating markets where there previously are none. And I think that really is where this concept of payments for ecosystem services is trying to make a difference in terms of highlighting these services that have been previously unrecognized and for which markets don't exist. Carbon sequestration, carbon markets are starting just now. Water purification, habitat conservation. These are types of contributions from ecosystems that we're not used to paying for. And so that's where this concept of payments for ecosystem services is meant to step in and correct. All right, we've seen that there are different, obviously, a large variety of ecosystem services. There are different types of deals, different types of transactions. In some cases, we're talking about fixing markets. In other cases, we're talking about creating markets. I think overall, payments for ecosystem services can be seen as a pretty broad concept. Just looking at the name, payments for ecosystem services, almost sounds like it's synonymous to simply financing conservation, paying for nature. So what makes it really stand out from previous efforts? I mean, for example, it's been a while that we've been paying entrance fees into national parks. We're paying for the benefit we get from enjoying the beautiful scenery, the access to biodiversity in an entrance fee. There's nothing new about paying an entrance fee to visit a national park. But this concept of payments for ecosystem services, although it kind of refers to the same type of thing, is seen as more innovative. So what really is different in it? And I think that a lot of the expectations around payments for ecosystem services come from this specific example, from this specific model of how dependencies and relationships between beneficiaries and providers can be better managed through these types of incentives. This is the case of New York City. Maybe some of you have already heard of this. Basically, the city was faced with a situation where it needed to improve the water quality for the residents, and faced with the costs of a new water treatment facility of being just to build between 4 and 6 billion, and obviously then running some annual maintenance costs of the order of 250 million per year. And what they decided to do instead of building the water treatment facility was to set up a sustainable watershed management system upstream in the area from which it gets its water supply, this Catskills watershed, which is several miles away from the city. So by setting up this reform, obviously involved regulatory reform, it involved consultations, a lot of meetings with landowners and farmers up in this area, and also financial incentives, payments for farm level control, obviously providing them with incentives to change the way they manage their lands, how they dispose of manure, for example, providing incentives to plant buffer zones around the field so to control the runoff. Basically, it was a whole system of incentivizing the landowners to reduce the pollution to the water, and that's how New York City was able to improve the water quality for its residents. So there is the classic example. Wow, this is a great system. We've saved a lot of money. We did not need to build a big